قال المؤلف رحمه الله, said the author, may Allah have mercy upon him. تنبيه, notice. ذكر التفتزاني في شرحه على هذه العقيدة أن قولنا لموسى كليم الله ليس لأنه سمع الكلام الذاتي. At-Taftazani mentioned in his explanation of this creedal document, the creed of An-Nasafiyyah, that our saying, that what we say about Moses, that he is Kalimullah, that means the one to whom God spoke, it's not because he heard the self-speech, the speech of God's self, yani God's very speech. إنما معناه سمع صوتا دالا على كلام الله تعالى بغير واسطة ملك أو غيره. At-Taftazani said merely what it means to say that Moses is Kalimullah is that he heard a sound that refers to God's speech. Exalted is he, without the intermediary of an angel. Yani, he didn't hear an angel. It wasn't an angel. أو غيره. And it wasn't something else or someone else. لذلك سمي كليم الله. This is why, according to Taftazani, Moses is Kalimullah. Intaha. Intaha means end quote. وهذا غير مستحسن. The Shaykh says, this is not good. This is not deemed good. What At-Taftazani said. وذكر أنه لا يجوز أن يسمع ما ليس بصوت. And At-Taftazani mentioned also that it's not possible to hear something that's not a sound. وينقل هذا عن Al-Maturidi وينسبه إليه. And he documents this, he logs this about Al-Maturidi, that this is what Al-Maturidi says, and he attributes it to him. لكن الماتريدي or لكن الماتريدية, you could say it either way. لا يقول إن الكلام الذاتي الذي هو غير صوت لا يصح أن يسمع. The Shaykh says, but Al-Maturidi does not say that the self-speech, that God's very speech, which is not a sound, is not validly heard or possibly heard. That it's not valid to be heard. Shaykh says, Al-Maturidi doesn't say that. At-Taftazani says, Al-Maturidi says that. Yani, so some brothers, this is what they say. Subhanallah. A lot of things, I didn't know people say them, and then, yani, after we learned them, when Shaykh brings these things up, people really say these things. And mashallah, then I will have had a heads up that people say that. The Shaykh doesn't just choose some cases to say them, and just so that he would say them. He says, أما فيما يتعلق بموسى. Now, concerning what's related to Moses, فيحتمل أنه وجد ذلك في بعض عبارات الماتريدي. It is possible that that is found in some of the phrases of Al-Maturidi. فشهروا عنه هذا القول. And so then they made this famous about him. It's possible that that there are some phrases from Al-Maturidi about this, and then they made this famous. Yani, they said, And yani, that this is famous amongst the Maturidis, that this is the position of Al-Maturidi. Yeah, there's two issues here. One issue is, why is Moses called Kalimullah? And the other issue is it valid to hear something that's not a sound? So the Shaykh says, as for what's related to Moses, it's possible that some phrases of Al-Maturidi were found, and then they made this famous about him. وَنَحْنُ نَقُولُ, but we say, سَمَاعُ مَا لَيْسَ بِحَرْفٍ وَلَا صَوْتٍ جَائِزٌ مُمْكِنٌ. Hearing what is not a letter nor a sound is possible. فَكَمَا أَنَّهُ يَصِحُّ أَن يُسْمَعَ الْحَرْفُ وَالصَّوْتُ. So just as it is possible to hear a letter and a sound, كَذَلِكَ يَصِحُّ سَمَاعُ الْكَلَامِ الَّذِي لَيْسَ بِحَرْفٍ وَلَا صَوْتٍ. Likewise, it is valid to hear the speech that is not of a letter nor a sound. إِذَا أَزَالَ اللَّهُ الْمَانِعَ مِنَ الْعَبْدِ. If Allah removes what prevents that from his slave. Yani, the Shaykh is saying, the letter and the sound are hearable because they exist. And so also it is valid that God's speech be heard because it exists, if God removes what prevents the slave from hearing it. فإن قيل ما حكم قول المعتزلة سميع بذاته بصير بذاته عليم بذاته. All right, so yani, the Shaykh didn't go far here, didn't go into long details here. He mentioned two cases. Let me just repeat here. So he said, At-Taftazani mentioned in his explanation for this Aqidah of An-Nasafiyyah that our saying that Moses is Kalimullah, so he doesn't deny that Moses is Kalimullah, but he says it's not because he heard God's very speech. Rather, it's because he heard a sound that refers to God's speech, and it wasn't an angel that he heard, and it wasn't someone else or something else that he heard. And so he was called Kalimullah. Shaykh says, هذا غير مستحسن. This is not good. And he mentioned that it's not possible that what's not a sound would be heard. And he logs that about Al-Maturidi and attributes it to him. The Shaykh says, but Al-Maturidi doesn't say, so this is not about Moses being Kalimullah. What Al-Maturidi doesn't say, what the Shaykh denies that Al-Maturidi says, is not about the issue of Kalimullah. He says, what Al-Maturidi does not say that God's very speech, which is not a sound, is not possibly heard. So that's that one case. As for what pertains to Moses, he says, it's possible that some phrases were found. Some phrases of Al-Maturidi were found. And so they made this the famous saying about him. Yani, what At-Taftazani said. And we say hearing what is not a letter nor a sound is possible. And just as it is valid to hear a letter and a sound, what validates that? The fact that they exist. That's what validates it. Likewise, it is valid to hear God's very speech, which is not a letter or a sound. Why? For the same reason, because it exists. Why we don't hear it, though? Because Allah prevented us from hearing it. So it's hearable. إِذَا أَزَالَ اللَّهُ الْمَانِعَ مِنَ الْعَبْدِ. If Allah removes what prevents the slave from hearing it. فَإِنْ قِيلَ. So that's done. Now, Shaykh brings up a question. If it were said, ما حكم قول المعتزلة سميع بذاته بصير بذاته عليم بذاته? What is the judgment of the Mu'tazila saying about God? He's a hearer by his self, a seer by his self, a knower by his self. فالجواب أنه كفر. The answer is that it's blasphemy. And we learned about this before. You know why? Because he's denying the attributes of Allah. He's only confirming the name hearer, seer, knower. But the actual attribute of hearing, sight, and knowledge, he's denying it. That's why he says by his self, because he means to say not by hearing, not by sight, not by knowledge, rather by his self. That statement makes the self out to be the attribute. That's blasphemy. It's a denial of the attribute. That's blasphemy, and that's atheism. Denial of God's attributes is atheism. I was impressed with one person not too long ago. He was hearing these cases for the first time about saying knower by his self, not by knowledge, hearer by his self, not by knowledge, seer by his self, not by knowledge. That person said, that's atheism. Subhanallah, because maybe it might not occur to some people. The Shaykh said, أَمَّا مَنْ لَمْ يُكَفِّرْهُمْ. Now concerning anyone who did not deem them blasphemers for this talk, فإن كان يفهم من كلامهم منع زيادة الصفة لا أصل الصفة فلا يكفر. If he understands from this talk of theirs the denial of an extra attribute, not the attribute itself, then he doesn't blaspheme. But I'm not sure how to explain that talk there. أما من كان يفهم منهم نفي أصل الصفة فيكفر. As for who understands that they are denying the attribute itself, and then he doesn't deem them kafir for this talk, then he blasphemes. Yani, although I can't explain this sentence here, maybe I have something in my notes, but I'm not going to take a look now. It means, though, yani, the part that's important to understand is that it means if the person thinks they're not denying the attribute, when he hears one of them saying he's a hearer by himself, a seer by himself, a knower by himself, if he understands from this that they're not denying the attribute, then he doesn't blaspheme for not deeming them blasphemers. But the one who understands this talk of theirs, and he understands that it is a denial of the attributes, and he still does not deem them kafir for that, then he commits kufr himself. وَمَنْ شَكَّ فِي كُفْرِهِ عِنْدَئِذٍ أَوْ لَمْ يُكَفِّرْهُ يَكْفُرْ. So, whoever doubts about the blasphemy of the one who denies the attribute, or does not deem him as a kafir, he blasphemes. ثم إن المعتزلية بقوله الله سميع بذاته لا بصفة. Furthermore, indeed, the Mu'tazili, when he says God hears by his self, not by an attribute, يكون في الحقيقة نفى كونه تعالى عالما وسميعا وبصيرا وقادرا. He would in reality be denying God's being a knower and a hearer and a seer and powerful. وإنما تعمية على الناس يقول سميع بذاته لا بسمع. And merely blinding the people, or like what people say today, gaslighting the people. He says he's a hearer by himself, not by hearing. فهو مناقض نفسه. This person, this talker, is contradicting himself. This one who says he's a hearer by himself, not by hearing. He's a gaslighter. That means he's a person who wants to make other than reality seem to be reality. Or he wants to make what's reality not be deemed real. Not be deemed real. Yani, because he's using the adjective to fool the person who can't see what he's doing. Like the Shaykh says here, he's using the word ta'miyatan, like saying he's blinding the person. He's double talking, fast talking. He's a con man in religion. وَلِذَا قَالَ بَعْضُ الْعُلَمَاء, and this is why some of the scholars said, Al-Mu'tazilatu yakfurun hatta law aradu man'a ziyadati as-sifah. This is why some scholars said the Mu'tazila blaspheme even if they meant to deny something, yani, to deny an extra attribute. لأنه يلزم من قولهم هذا نفي أصل الصفة. Because this saying of theirs necessarily is a denial of the attribute. وَنَحْنُ لَا نَنْفِي عَنْهُمُ الْكُفْرِ. And we, Shaykh speaking about himself, we do not negate blasphemy from him. بَلِ الصَّوَابُ تَكْفِيرُهُمْ. Rather, what's correct is to deem them as blasphemers. وَلَا يَنْفَعُهُمْ قَوْلُهُمْ سَمِيعٌ بِذَاتِهِ لَا بِسَمْعٍ لَا بِسَمْعٍ قَائِنٍ بِذَاتِهِ. And it doesn't benefit them to say he's a hearer by himself, not by a hearing that exists by his being. عَالِمٌ بِذَاتِهِ لَا بِعِلْمٍ. And that he's a knower by himself, not by knowledge. لِأَنَّ هَذَا تَنَاقُض. Because this is contradictory. كَالَّذِي يَقُولُ. It's like someone saying هُوَ وَاحِدٌ وَلَيْسَ بِوَاحِدٍ. Oh, alimun wa laysa bi alim. He's one, but not one. Or he's a knower, but not a knower. هذا حاصله. This is the synopsis of it. ثم إن المعتزلة يقولون مقالة شنيعة. And furthermore, the Mu'tazila say an ugly statement. يقولون, they say, إن لم يفعل الله للعبد غاية مقدوره يكون بخيلا. If God does not do for the slave the best that he could do, then he would be a miser. ويقولون, and they say, ترك الأصلح بخل بخل وسفه. And they say leaving out what is best for the slave, not doing what is best for the slave, is miserliness and foolishness. So this means really they believe God is a miser and a fool. That's atheism. Well, they would say he's not a miser or a fool because he doesn't not do what is best. He only does for the slaves what is best. But in reality, that's not true. He does not always do for the slaves what is best. And so in reality, they are calling Allah a miser and a fool. Here's a footnote. وَلِهَذَا يَزْعُمُونَ أَنَّهُ يَجِبُ عَلَى اللَّهِ فِعْلُ الْأَصْلَحِ لِلْعَبْدِ. This is why they claim that it is God's duty to do what is best for the slave. تَعَالَى اللَّهُ عَنْ ذَلِكَ. Exalted is Allah from that. He's not obligated to do anything. God doesn't have any duty. Now, it's interesting here, how did the Shaykh get here to talk about the Mu'tazila denying these attributes. And yani, if you're following and you've been reviewing, you know right now we're talking about the speech of God in particular. How did he start talking here about their denial of the attributes when we're talking about the speech of God and the meaning of the Qur'an, and whether it could be said the Qur'an is created or not? Because there's something in the talk of At-Taftazani. There's something in the talk of At-Taftazani that has a hint of what those Mu'tazila say. So that was, as they say, a way for the Shaykh to segue into that issue there. The Mu'tazila, they say Allah can't be seen because he's not a body. At-Taftazani is saying his speech can't be heard because it's not a sound. And he attributed that to Al-Maturidi, and the Shaykh says Al-Maturidi doesn't say that. And Shaykh says, but as for what they found about Musa, why Musa is called Kalimullah, maybe they have, or there has been found something in the phrases of Al-Maturidi, and then they made this famous about him. قال المؤلف رحمه الله, said the author, may Allah have mercy upon him. وهو مكتوب في مصاحفنا محفوظ في قلوبنا مقروء بألسنتنا مسموع بآذاننا غير حال فيها. And it, the Qur'an, is written in our scriptures and memorized in our hearts and recited by our tongues, heard by our ears, not dwelling in any of that. Yani, but not dwelling in any of that. So this is an important case here. This is where the scholars are using some words with a double meaning. So you need to pay attention so that you don't misunderstand what they are saying. Let's see what the Shaykh has for us. SharH, the explanation. أن القرآن يقال فيه إنه مكتوب في مصاحفنا, is that the Quran, it is said about it, it is written in our scriptures. So what's religiously the first meaning of Al-Quran? Religiously, the first meaning of Al-Quran is the very speech of God, not the document. So what he means to say here is the speech, the very speech of God, yani, is written in the Mus'haf. That means the words written in the Mus'haf refer to the very speech of God. That's the intended meaning here. What is the word again for the double meaning in Arabic? Well, what's being done here in Arabic is called istikhdam. Istikhdam. It has a particular definition, though. Inshallah, I'll come to it so that I don't go too far from where I am right now. Because when you say the Quran is written in our mushafs, what do you understand from that? So someone might understand from that, yeah, okay, you have mushaf, and that mushaf is the Quran. That's not what he's saying. He's saying the Quran, which is the speech of God, there are words written on pages that refer to it. That's what he's saying. The Quran, which is the very speech of God, there are words written in the mushaf that refer to it. And the Quran, which is the very speech of God, we memorize those words in our heart that refer to it. And we recite with our tongues those words that refer to the very speech of God. This is what he's saying. الشرح أن القرآن يقال فيه إنه مكتوب في مصاحفنا. The explanation is that it is said about the Quran that it is indeed written in our mushafs. The Quran is written in our mushafs. أي بأشكال الكتابة الحروف الدالة عليه, meaning written by the shapes of the writing, the shapes of the letters that refer to it. محفوظ في قلوبنا, and memorized in our hearts. أي بالألفاظ المتخيلة, meaning by the imaginary words. The imaginary words, that means what we have in our hearts. If a person now, just without saying anything, if he imagines Al-Fatiha in his heart, for example, or let's say if he recites Al-Fatiha only in his heart, so it's like those are imaginary words. That refers to the very speech of God. It is not itself the very speech of God refers to it, though. مَقْرُوءٌ بِأَلْسِنَتِنَا, and recited by our tongues. أي بالحروف الملفوظة المسموعة, meaning by the pronounced letters. It is recited by our tongues. The pronounced heard letters. مسموع بآذاننا, and heard by our ears. غير حال فيها, but not dwelling in any of that. أي أن الكلام الذاتي ليس حالا في المصاحف, meaning that God's very speech is not dwelling in the mushafs, in the scriptures. ولا في القلوب, nor in the hearts. والألسنة, nor on the tongues. ولا هو المسموع بآذاننا, nor is God's very speech that which we hear by our ears when a reciter recites. إنما المكتوب بأشكال الحروف, rather, what is written by the shapes of the letters. والمحفوظ في القلوب, and what is preserved in the hearts. والمقروء بالألسن, and what is recited by the tongues. والمسموع بالآذان, and what is heard by the ears. هو اللفظ المنزل, it is the revealed wording. لا عين الصفة, لا عين الصفة القديمة, not the very eternal self, not the very eternal attribute. فإنها معنى قائم بذات الله, that eternal attribute is an attribute that exists by God's being. وتقريب ذلك أن يقال, and the approximation of that is that it is said, النار جوهر محرق Fire is a burning substance. يذكر باللفظ. It is mentioned by word. ويكتب بالقلم, and written by pen. ولا يلزم منه كون حقيقة النار صوتا وحرفا. And this does not mean that fire in reality is a letter and a sound. So he's saying fire is a burning substance, meaning that's its reality. Fire, the very fire itself, its reality is that it's a burning substance. This burning substance is mentioned. So when you say fire, that doesn't mean that the burning substance is on your tongue. And if you write fire, that doesn't mean that the burning substance came out of your pen and got onto the paper. Yani, so then the burning substance is not a letter or a sound, just because you can mention it and you can write what refers to it. وَيُقَالُ فِي تَقْرِيبِ ذَلِكَ أَيْضًا. And it is also said in approximating that also, إِنَّ لِلشَّيْءِ وُجُودًا فِي الْأَعْيَانِ, that indeed something would have a real existence. وَوُجُودًا فِي الْأَذْهَانِ, and it would have a conceived existence. وَوُجُودًا فِي الْعِبَارَةِ, and it would have an expressed existence, a worded existence, a phrased existence. وَوُجُودًا فِي الْكِتَابَةِ, and it would have a written existence. So I hope that's clear for you. It means something would be, something would have a real existence, the very thing, actually. So that's not a word, that's not a sound, etc. That thing. And something could have an existence in mind. What you have in mind doesn't mean is really the very thing. Like, that's why we said in some previous lesson, some scholars said Allah exists fil kharij. That means outside of ourselves. What does that mean, outside of ourselves? That doesn't mean he exists in a place. That means his existence is not merely our conception. What we conceive in ourselves is something. So we think we are created beings. So each one of us, I think about God and you think about God. Building doesn't think about God. Building's not alive. So for me, when I walk around, God is not something inside of me because I have some conception, which is my own attribute. My conception, which is my own attribute. My conception of God is not his reality, but from my own perspective, God exists in my conception. He is not my conception. He is not my very conception itself, but I conceive him, and you conceive him. And he is not your very conception itself. He has an actual existence that's not our conception. And we have a conception. And we might write, or we might say God with our tongues, and we might write God with our pens. فَالْكِتَابَةُ تَدُلُّ عَلَى الْعِبَارَةِ. The writing refers to the wording. The writing refers back to the wording, the phrasing. وَهِيَ عَلَى مَا فِي الْأَذْهَانِ, and the wording or phrasing refers back to the conception. وَهُوَ عَلَى مَا فِي الْأَعْيَانِ, and the conception refers to what actually exists. فَحَيْثُ يُوصَفُ الْقُرْآنُ بِمَا هُوَ مِنْ لَوَازِمِ الْقَدِيمِ. So whenever the Qur'an is described with what could only be the attribute of the eternal. كما في قولنا القرآن غير مخلوق. Like if we were to say, the Qur'an is uncreated. فالمراد به حقيقته. So what's meant by it then is its reality, يعني the very speech of God. Al-Mawjudatu fil Kharij, that speech of God that exists beyond our mere conception. This is some deep stuff here, mashallah. وَالْمُرَادُ بِالْخَارِجِ خَارِجُ الْأَذْهَانِ. The Shaykh explains, what's meant by outside is outside, yani beyond the mere conception. Kharij means outside or beyond here. So what's meant by outside, if you want to translate it that way, is beyond the mere conception. وَحَيْثُ يُوصَفُ بِمَا هُوَ مِنْ لَوَازِمِ الْمَخْلُوقَاتِ. And whenever the Qur'an is described with something that is necessarily for creations, يُرَادُ بِهِ الْأَلْفَاظُ الْمَنْطُوقَةِ الْمَسْمُوعَةِ, then what's meant by it are the pronounced, heard words. كما في قولنا, like if we were to say قرأت نصف القرآن, I recited half of the Qur'an, because something eternal can't be divided into half, so this must be in reference to something created. أو المتخيلة, or refers to what we envision. كما في قولنا حفظت القرآن, like for us to say I memorized the Qur'an. أو الأشكال المنقوشة أو الأشكال المنقوشة. I lost my i'rab, hold on. يراد به الألفاظ, yes. أو المتخيلة الألفاظ المنطوقة المسموعة أو المتخيلة أو الأشكال المنقوشة. Or it refers to the scripted letters. كما في قولنا, like for us to say يحرم على المحدث مس القرآن. It is forbidden for someone who lacks wudu to touch the Qur'an. ولما كان دليل الأحكام الشرعية هو اللفظ دون المعنى القديم. And when it was that the evidence for the sacred laws is the wording, not the eternal attribute, عرفه أئمة الأصول بالمكتوب في المصاحف. Then the scholars of the fundamentals, the imams of the fundamentals, identified it as what is written in the mushafs. Al-manqul bitawatur, that which is transmitted by successive mass narration. وَجَعَلُوهُ اسْمًا لِلنَّظْمِ, and they made the word Al-Qur'an a name for that composition, the composition. وَالْمَعْنَى جَمِيعًا, and also it's a name for the attribute. They made the word Al-Qur'an a name for the composition and a name for the attribute, both of them. أي للنظم من حيث الدلالة على المعنى لا لمجرد المعنى. Meaning they made it a name for the composition because of its referring to the attribute, not merely the attribute. وأما الكلام القديم, and as for the eternal speech, الذي هو صفة لله, that eternal attribute which is an attribute of God, that eternal speech which is an attribute of God. تعالى, exalted is he. فذهب الأشعري إلى أنه يجوز أن يسمع. Al-Ash'ari took the position that it is possible to be heard. وهو الصواب, and that's correct. كما قدمنا, as we have already presented. So you might meet some brothers, they say, we're Maturidis, and we don't say that the speech of Allah is heard, because it's not a sound. And that's what Al-Maturidi said. Shaykh Abdullah says, Al-Maturidi didn't say that something that's not a sound can't be heard. And now, after knowing the Shaykh's exactness, if I wanted to indulge in this conversation with one of those brothers, I'd challenge him. Yani, this is not harsh debate here. I would just say, do you have a reference? Even I would be testing to see if what the Shaykh said is, because Shaykh said, Al-Maturidi doesn't say that. So then, if a Shaykh is correct here, that means they don't have a reference. And Shaykh is usually right. So I'd ask him, out of curiosity, I want to see what he has. And we'll see. And probably he doesn't have a reference. We'll see. قال الإمام أبو حنيفة في الفقه الأكبر. Imam Abu Hanifa said in Al-Fiqh al-Akbar, Subhanallah, Al-Fiqh al-Akbar. One day I understood what that title means. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi. وَالْقُرْآنُ كَلَامُ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. He said, the Qur'an is the speech of God. Exalted is He. فِي الْمَصَاحِفِ مَكْتُوبٍ. In the scriptures it is written. وَفِي الْقُلُوبِ مَحْفُوظ. And in the hearts it is memorized. وَعَلَى الْأَلْسُنِ مَقْرُوء. And upon the tongues it is recited. وَعَلَى النَّبِيِّ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ مُنَزَّلٌ. And upon the prophet it is revealed. وَلَفْظُنَا بِالْقُرْآنِ مَخْلُوقٌ. And our pronunciation of the Qur'an is created. وَكِتَابَتُنَا لَهُ مَخْلُوقَةٌ. And our writing of it is created. وَقِرَاءَتُنَا لَهُ مَخْلُوقَةٌ. And our recitation of it is created. وَالْقُرْآنُ غَيْرُ مَخْلُوقٍ. And the Qur'an is not created. Yani, the Qur'an itself is not created. Intaha, end quote. وَقَالَ فِي الْوَصِيَّةِ. And Abu Hanifa said in Al-Wafiyyah, نُقِرُّ بِأَنَّ الْقُرْآنَ كَلَامُ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. We confess that the Qur'an is the speech of God. Exalted is He. وَوَحْيُهُ. And His revelation. See, there's the double meaning. He said it's the speech of God and His revelation. So the revelation is not God's attribute itself. So he's saying the word Qur'an has two meanings. It refers to His speech and it refers to His revelation. وَتَنْزِيلُهُ وَصِفَتُهُ مَكْتُوبٌ فِي الْمَصَاحِفِ. Abu Hanifa said in Al-Wafiyyah, His attribute is written in the Mushafs. So what does it mean? It means what's written in the Mushafs refers to His attribute. مَقْرُوءٌ بِالْأَلْسُنِ. And recited by the tongues. مَحْفُوظٌ فِي الصُّدُورِ. And memorized in the chests. غَيْرُ حَالٍ فِيهَا. Not dwelling in any of that. مسألة, case. من الأدلة الظاهرة على أن اللفظ المنزل يطلق عليه أنه كلام الله. Amongst the obvious proofs that the revealed words are called God's speech. قوله تعالى is what God said. Exalted is He. يريدون أن يبدلوا كلام الله. Those pagans want to pervert God's speech. That's the 15th verse of Surah Al-Fatih. لأن كلام الله هنا هو المسموع الذي يسمع من التالي. This is a proof because the kalam of Allah that's mentioned in the ayah, because it says kalamullah, kalam Allah, God's speech. So God's speech here is what's heard from the reciter. إن كان التالي الرسول أو غيره, whether the reciter was the messenger or anyone else. وصفات الله تعالى لا تسلط للخلق عليها. But as for God's attributes, the creations have no access to them so that they could pervert them. فتعين أن يكون المراد بكلام الله هنا. So I had a word for تعين, a good word to use as a translation. Inshallah will come back to me. It came to me one day while I was walking down the street. By process of elimination, then, what's meant by the speech of God here is the revealed words. That might have been it, by process of elimination. فَتَعَيَّنَ أَنْ يَكُونَ الْمُرَادُ بِكَلَامِ اللَّهِ هُنَا اللَّفْظَ الْمُنَزَّلِ. So by process of elimination, then, what's meant by the speech of God here is the revealed words. وَهَذَا اللَّفْظُ هُوَ الَّذِي يُمْكِنُ أَنْ يُغَيِّرُوهُ. This wording is what is possible for the slaves to pervert if they got their hands on it. Yani, this doesn't mean it's possible to alter the Qur'an to the point that the Qur'an is lost. No. The Qur'an will never be lost. It's preserved. But if a slave got his hands on a document of the Qur'an, it would be possible for him to erase words and change letters and things like that. وَهُوَ الَّذِي أَرَادَ الْكُفَّارُ أَن يُبَدِّلُوهُ. That is what the blasphemers wanted to change. وقال الإمام أبو حنيفة, يعني, we'll see some verses like that as we go through the tafsir. If you're following in the tafsir lessons, we'll see some verses like that. The kuffar would hear something of the Quran, they wouldn't like it. Just like today, they would hear something, it would offend them. Sometimes they would suggest to Muhammad to change it. They would say to him, why don't you say something else? And Allah revealed to the Prophet that to say to them, I have no right to say something else. وقال الإمام أبو حنيفة في هذه المسألة. Imam Abu Hanifa said in this case, or about this case, ما قام بالخالق فهو قديم. What is attributed to the Creator is eternal. وَمَا قَامَ بِالْمَخْلُوقِ فَهُوَ مَخْلُوقٌ. And what is attributed to the creation is created. And even if we're using the same word. وَكُلُّ أَهْلِ الْحَقِّ مُتَّفِقُونَ عَلَى أَنَّ الصِّفَةَ الْأَزَلِيَّةَ التي ليست بحرف وصوت هو الكلام القائم بذات الله. And all of the people of the truth are in agreement that the eternal attribute that is neither of letter nor sound is the speech that exists by God's being. وهو غير مخلوق, and it is uncreated. وَأَمَّا اللَّفْظُ الْمُنَزَّلُ فَهُوَ قَائِمٌ بِالْمَخْلُوقِ مُحْدَثٌ. And as for the revealed phrases, that is existing by creations, and it is something that happens. Yani, because you're going to pick up a pen and start writing the words, or you're going to open your mouth and start reciting, for example, or you're going to turn on your printer and start printing pages. فَمَا قَامَ بِالْخَالِقِ فَلَيْسَ بِمَخْلُوقٍ. So anything that is attributed to the Creator, it is not created. وَمَا قَامَ بِالْمَخْلُوقِ فَهُوَ مَخْلُوقٌ. And anything that is attributed to the creation, then it is created. Wallahu a'lam.